Good afternoon, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Folklore. I'm going to continue with the third and final part of the lecture, my lecture on oral history, myth and Egyptian folklore. This component, which is the third and final component, focuses on ancient Egyptian folklore. It may be said that in comparison to the Hellenistic poets and playwrights like Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, and great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, ancient Egypt did not foster literary greats, although it produced equally great literature which remains relatively unknown to modern audiences. It is possible that many writers of the ancient world had access to much of this literature, as the story of the Trojan horse in the Iliad and the tale of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves bear striking resemblance to the capture of Joppa, which is modern Jaffa in Palestine, by Thutmosis III, who introduced baskets concealing soldiers into the town under the pretense of a gift. The literary compositions of archaic Egypt were wholly or partly preserved on papyri and ranged from narratives and tales to instructional wisdom teachings and poetry. It is probable that religious motives like the dying and resurrecting God, the Trinity, duality of being in the guise of good and evil, and the triumphs of truth over falsehood, magical and alchemical motives like protective amulets, the power inherent in one's name, giving control, mystical metallurgical practices and the casting of spells, and symbolic motives centered around colors, trees, plants, flowers and animals all had their origins in the folklore of Egypt and are the remnants of a potential mass of unrecorded oral myth. The known tribulations of Isis and Osiris, the greatest myth and first love story to propagate from Egypt, was never recorded because it was so heavily embedded in the hearts of all ancient Egyptians. Our knowledge of it comes from the Greek writer Plutarch, who transcribed it millennia after it was first told by prehistoric storytellers. This myth may or may not carry historical factual information. In Peri Isidoske Osiridos, Plutarch relates how Osiris, the beneficent god, once ruled over Egypt with his sister wife, Isis, bringing culture and civilization to cannibals and barbarians who settled along the Nile Delta. Seth, their evil brother, grew jealous of Osiris's fame and fortune and hatched a treacherous plot with 72 associate conspirators. He threw a party for Osiris and suggested to all present that they should play a game which involved a chest. The winner, claimed Seth, would be the individual who could fit perfectly inside the container. Not surprisingly, the dimensions had been custom-tailored to the weight and size of Osiris, and so when the benevolent god opted to try his luck by climbing inside, all Seth and the conspirators had to do was slam the lid shut before he could lift himself out. Once the deed had been done, they hurled it violently into the Nile. Lamentably, Osiris drowned during the ordeal, and the coffin, now entangled in the roots of a tree, was carried by the current down to the Lebanese port of Vivlos, where it was fished out and used in the construction of a royal palace. Isis, lamenting her husband's death, proceeded to hide her infant son Horus in the Delta marshes before going to search for him. She revealed her magical powers to the king and queen of Vivlos, who were so impressed that they offered to gift her anything in their household. To their surprise, Isis chose a pilar of wood that held up part of the palace complex. Upon returning to Egypt, she hid the coffin in the Delta marshes for the sake of collecting her son, but Seth found it whilst he was out hunting for wild animals and cut up the body into 14 pieces, scattering them in different locations all over Egypt. Noteworthy here is the astronomical significance of numbers. The 72 conspirators could allude to the 72 years that it takes the sun to move through 1 degree of the precessional cycle, and the 14 pieces of the body, the 14 days that it takes the full moon to transform into the dark moon. Isis, together with Anubis, the jackal-headed god, who was the offspring of Osiris and Nephthys, found the individual pieces and mummified them. These were buried at the site at which they were found, so the head, for instance, was interred beneath the stars of Abydos, whilst the heart was buried at Biger, near Philae. His penis was the only body part that wasn't found because he had been swallowed by an Oxyrhynchus fish. Of course, this didn't faze the mighty Isis, who simply manufactured a wooden one for him. In many versions of this myth, Isis became pregnant with Horus after installing the dead Osiris with an artificial penis and beating her wings as to bring him back to life long enough for him to impregnate her. Mythically, this is the first instance we have of an immaculate conception. In other versions of the story, Horus had already been born as he was stung in the marshes by a scorpion when Isis went to look for her dead brother husband. Following his resurrection, Osiris presided over judgment or psychostasia, in the Hall of Two Truths, allowing only those who had been pure of heart continued existence in the afterlife, which the Egyptians referred to as the Amenti. The myth is basically a prototype for Egyptian eschatological beliefs concerning life beyond death, for the individual soul to reach the Egyptian paradise and dwell there eternally. The physical shell had to remain incorrupt. It also identifies the dead king with Osiris and his successor with Horus, the rightful heir of Osiris's earthly kingdom. The seminal power of this myth was to intimately bind Egypt's religious beliefs with politics. For the head of state, the pharaoh was the son of Osiris, and his firstborn son was the child god Horus, who would succeed his father in the dynasty. It was also the reason for brother-sister marriages in ancient Egypt, a custom which was also adopted by the ancient Macedonians. Of course, the epic transcribing the friction between the forces of good and evil doesn't end there. Composed in the New Kingdom, so between 1550 and 1069 BCE, the contendings of Horus and Seth describe the power struggle for the inheritance of the earthly kingdom between Horus, the son of Osiris, and Seth, the evil uncle attempting to usurp his brother's throne. In this myth, a jury composed of the sun god Ra and several other Egyptian gods couldn't quite make up their minds as to who the earthly kingdom should be awarded to. Neith, the great goddess residing at Sais, close to the Nile Delta, warned that if the kingdom didn't go to Horus, the sky would collapse and plunge the world into chaos. At one stage, the court was forced to transfer to an island so that Isis, who encompassed an obvious biased opinion, could not follow the trial. The attempt to preclude her from court proceedings was a dismal failure, for Isis assumed the guise of an old hag and fooled the ferryman Nemti into transporting her across. Once there, she transformed into a femme fatale and seduced Seth into indirectly admitting moral misconduct and condemning his own behaviour, through a cleverly spun narrative in which she related the tribulation of a widow, her young son, and a stranger who shows up randomly on their doorstep and attempts to take control of their property. Upon hearing Seth's confession, Isis transformed into a swallow and flew to the divine jurors to convey the fateful news and finalize the matter. However, a lack of unanimity on their part played into Seth's hands, who dutifully appealed to them for further deliberation before challenging Horus to another contest. One of these was an intense underwater competition that required both contestants to transform into hippopotami and stay submerged in the Nile for a period of about 3 months. He who could ruminate there the longest without coming up for air would be declared the winner. At this point, Isis was made to appear indecisive and weak-willed. Suffering acute pangs of guilt for hitting her own brother with a harpoon, she utilizes magical invocation to detract it. Mortified by what is perceived as an ultimate act of betrayal, Horus scurried out of the Nile and punished his mother by decapitating her. Retribution for Isis was then sought by Seth, who tracked down Horus and gouged out his eyes whilst he lay complacent beneath a tree in the western desert. The goddess Hathor found the eyeless Horus crying in the desert, and acting out of sheer pity restored his eyesight by pouring the milk of a gazelle onto them. In subsequent events, Seth publicly humiliated Horus by raping him, but Horus managed to have the last laugh. He did this by catching Seth's semen before it could enter him, disposing of it in the marshes, and then proceeding to spread his own on Seth's favourite food, which was lettuce. When the authenticity of the rape story was questioned by Thoth in court, the place of both gods' semen was magically recalled from their place of rest. Seth spoke out from the marshes, whilst Horus's spoke out from Seth's stomach. Enraged beyond reckoning by this public humiliation and unwilling to admit defeat at the hands of a much younger opponent, Seth challenged Horus to a boat race. It was agreed by both parties that the boats had to be made of stone. Seth carved his out of mountain peak, but Horus, being the shrewd and wily son of Isis, made his out of pine wood, cleverly disguised to look like stone. The former had a tantrum when he realized his boat was going to sink to the bottom of the river, and so to remedy the situation, he smashed up Horus's vessel. Osiris, who had been witnessing the whole fiasco from the underworld, sent threatening messages to the assembly of divine jurors that if they did not pick up their act and award the kingdom to Horus, he would degenerate the world back to the sludge of primordial chaos. The warning quickly dispelled their inertia and facilitated a unanimous decision whereby it was agreed that Horus was the rightful ruler and would take the corporeal throne. According to the written papyrological records, the entire battle lasted over about 80 years. The contendings of Horus and Seth may also have an astronomical basis, denoting the existence of a stellar religion prior to the solar patriarchal one propagated by the Heliopolitan priests. Further still, the ongoing battles of Horus and Seth might have a precessional basis, the question being which constellation of the equinoxes, so Scorpio or Taurus, would gain the ascendancy after Orion, or Osiris, had been obliterated from the night sky. That ends our lecture today, my lecture today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you next time for something different. See you then.